Soon. Our next Lunch and Learn is December 7, a historic day in American history, Pearl Harbor Day. We have our possible guest, it's not confirmed yet, is Anat Hoffman of the Israel Religious Action Center, and that'd be wonderful if she's able to just confirming that now. Partner in all our work with Rabbi Saperstein. So before we start our program, delighted that Rabbi Prosman is able to be with us this morning, and I want to ask him to share a few words.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be with all of you as well. We first gather on the 82nd anniversary of Kristallnacht, and so we wanted to mark that moment this morning. We will also mark that moment on Friday evening. Phyllis Buxbaum will be sharing a story of her husband Saul with us on Friday night, and we will have other reflections at services. But I begin with a poem for this moment. Creator of all, source and shelter, grant a perfect rest under your tabernacle of peace to those who perished in the Holocaust. Our fathers and mothers, our sisters and brothers, our rabbis and teachers, our neighbors and children, the named and the unnamed whose lives were cut off by brutal, vicious, cunning, and calculated violence. May they find peace in the world to come. Remember the survivors who have since passed away, and the virtues of our people who died at the hands of malice. In every generation, we remember the works of their hands and the messages of their hearts. Bless the defenders of Israel with safety and strength, and the righteous of all nations who provide protection, shelter, and comfort to the Jewish people. Let their deeds be a source of favor in heaven and healing on earth. Put an end to anger, hatred, and fear, and lead us to a time when no one will suffer at the hand of another, speedily in our days. May the memories of all who face these horrors be sanctified with joy and love. May their soul be bound up in the bonds of life, a living blessing in our midst. And so as we mark this moment, we also mark a moment in our nation as well. And so this past Shabbat, as the election results were being announced, I was on the bima with bat mitzvah students, and I heard a little buzzing of phones. I knew what was happening. But also when I got home from Shabbat services, I learned of the death of a towering rabbi and theologian and educator, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Many times at Shabbat services, I quote Rabbi Sacks. He's written over 20 books from essays on each Torah portion, reflections on leadership, and living a moral life. And so to begin this conversation with Rabbi Ambassador David Saperstein, I want to quote him again. He's quoted in The Dignity of Difference. In a debate, one side wins, the other loses, but both are the same as they were before in a conversation. Some would say that is true of elections as well. Neither side, in a conversation though, neither side loses and both are changed because they now know what reality looks like from a different perspective. That is not to say that either gives us up its previous convictions. That is not what conversation is about. It does mean, however, that I may now realize that I must make space for another deeply held belief. And if my own case has been compelling, the other side may understand that it too must make space for mine. Elections are created to divide us. You are either in this camp or that camp. You either put up a lawn sign of this person or that person. And now that our election is over, our job is to figure out what unites us and what needs to be done to move us forward. Our community, our country, and our world face many challenges. And I pray that we as a synagogue can find a way to address some of these challenges, as well as our newly elected officials as well. And so I am so glad to be here this morning with all of you. I turn it over to Rabbi Kroloff.
I think we lost you for a moment, but internet, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you conclude, Rabbi President?
Did, yes.
Okay, I lost you. Okay. Thank you for those beautiful words. Rabbi David Saperstein is no stranger to Temple Emanu-El in Westfield. He's been here many times and been our teacher and friend and my personal friend for many, many decades. Delighted, David, to welcome you back. Rabbi Saperstein, as most of you know, is a longtime director of the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism in Washington, D.C. And during the last 2 years of the Obama administration, served as United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. And in that role, he was a close colleague of our newly re-elected United States Congressman, Tom Malinowski, and knows Congressman Malinowski very well. David, we're delighted that you're with us. Thank you for being here. You didn't have to travel too far, made it a little bit easier. We hope you've been well and that Ellen's well. And we say Baruch haba, welcome again to Westfield and the surrounding area.
Well, thank you so much.
David, I should have added that there'll be opportunity for questions. And if you will include those in the chat room, Rabbi President and I will monitor it and we'll provide those questions at the conclusion. I should mention one other thing. I did already mention December 7 is our next date. David, thank you and welcome.
Well, if you actually have Anat Hoffman, you couldn't have anyone better. Here, she's just a phenomenon in Israel and such an effective champion for Reform Jewish rights and for so many other causes that are dear to, I'm sure, the entire listenership here. It's wonderful to be back at the congregation. I would have much preferred to have done it in person. And I look forward to that opportunity. But Rabbi Kroloff is one of the Gedolei Hador, one of the great ones of our generation. And he and Terry and his family have been friends of mine for 50 years. And it is a friendship that I deeply, deeply cherish. Here, and likewise, Rabbi President and his family have been friends. Our fathers worked together, and you and I have had the chance to work together in our own right, Rabbi President. So it makes it a special pleasure to be here. And I just want to second your comments about Rabbi Sachs. He became a dear friend. He was a champion of my brother's writings. My brother is a very respected Jewish historian. And he really, during the time that I was U.S. ambassador, was an enormous supporter of my work here and in my academic work. Coming to grips with his writings is always something that you have to do when you write in the field of religion and public life. Anywhere, without exaggeration, he probably was, for the last 20, 25 years, the leading Jewish public intellectual on the global scene. So it is a tremendous loss to the community. So I have been asked to address the forgive me for a second here, just trying to get something off my screen that popped up. I asked to address the election and what are the takeaways from the election. So let me begin by just offering 10 key lessons that I have from this election. Here, it'll take me just a few minutes to do it. But as I'm doing it, I'd like to ask everyone who's part of the community today to think, what is the key takeaway you took from this election? Either the key insight or the most urgent question that you think the election raises. And if you don't hear it in the list I'm putting forward, please just put it into the chat screen. I'd love to see and hear other people's takeaways here. It's always interesting, and I get to steal it from my speeches when you add to the interesting insights. So here you go. One, The record number of people who voted on both sides of our partisan divide was an affirmation of the American democratic system. That it transpired with no violence on election day, as many feared, and very little while the prolonged vote count ensued, was also an affirmation of our democracy. Let me just add another note that occurred to me today related to this, just in terms of foreign policy. All across the globe, we have seen the rise of authoritarian rulers here. And like, we can talk more about that. It is one of the most alarming changes, and Tom Malinowski and I worked together so hard as the beginnings of this were happening to strengthen democratic forces all across the globe. He was amazing in the work that he did. The first one to vote out someone who was perceived as having authoritarian tendencies, defined by attacks on the media, attacks on on elections and legitimacy of elections, attacks on people who disagreed with them as enemies of the country, et cetera, was the vote that happened here. And in that sense, it is an extraordinary affirmation of our democracy. Secondly, at the same time, this is an alarmingly divided nation. Not only do we have diametrically different views on parties, on candidates, on President Trump, but on the very facts that we're living with. Is the economy doing well, or is it in deep trouble? Is the pandemic a serious threat or not? Has the administration handled it admirably or disastrously? Is the country moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? The exit polls affirmed enormous splits, divides over how people feel on those issues and what the correlation is between one candidate or another, depending on the answer to those questions. Third, compared to what we feared, and in part because of all the work that our public servants did and civil society folks like us and our allies did, we had a comparatively smooth election. Not many successful efforts of election day voter suppression actually occurred, which many on the liberal side thought, and very few instances of voter fraud took place, which many on the right were fearful of. Of course, there were years of voter suppression efforts since the passage of the court's decision in the Shelby case that took place before Election Day that remain a central challenge for our nation. But so far, very little of either and very few protests during or immediately after Election Day. Fourth, the polls were just wrong. And because they appear, and by the way, when I say polls, the poll that has consistently been the most accurate actually are the exit polls. Here, but I'm putting that aside. I'm putting aside all the polls that happened before. And it's not obviously just the polls, because they get reported in our media, which has already been so damaged by Trump's attack on the media as the enemy of the people. And the fact that the polls have been reported over meant that the journalism is perceived as being wrong, and trust in news media now faces serious possibility of being further diminished and tarnished here. So there will be a serious assessment by polling experts and journalists about the role of polls going forward and how they should be reporting. Fifth, the gender gap remains a huge factor in elections. In every cohort assessed by the exit polls, women continue to be more likely to vote for a Democrat than men did, and 15 to 20% more likely to vote for Biden over Trump here. Across almost every grouping that you see breakdowns of in the exit polls. The gains among suburban women helped Vice President Biden significantly. So the gender gap remains a central challenge for the Republican Party. Conversely, Vice President Biden made advances with blue collar workers, but not nearly as much as was anticipated. If you think about the maps that you were watching endlessly on television from Tuesday through Saturday, here in those swing states, in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, Here, when you looked at those swing states, President Trump really held on to the counties that he had switched. Biden won because of the enormous turnout within the areas that Hillary had taken in the last election. But he did not take back many of the areas that have been longtime Democratic strongholds that President Trump had switched in the last election. And this remains a central challenge for the Democratic Party for reasons I'll talk about in a few moments. 7, President Trump did pick up increased support from Black and Hispanic voters, mostly from Black and Hispanic men, but they remain overwhelmingly Democratic voters. 8, Biden won by running to the center, while at the same time, if you look at the platform of the party or at the policy papers he put out, his policies were actually much more progressive than his moderate views on a handful of the key contentious issues like fracking, trade issues, Buy American, those kinds of issues. But what does he do now to bring together the different wings of the party together? If you look at coalitions that would vote in presidents before, very often, once they're voted in, they get attacked by their more extreme wings, here are their left wing, their right wing. Here, it'll be interesting to see what happens. And President Trump, insofar as he did as well as he did it by running to the right and appealing to his base for turnout that really did turn out on election day. One of the ironies is his disparaging mail-in elections, mail-in ballots, here in urging his people not to do mail-in ballots, but showed up. Here was a high-risk gamble that he probably lost him the election. Here, and had the weather been bad, it would have been disastrous for him, but the weather basically held up all across the country. So the question is, what are their lessons in terms of President Trump's strategy, its successes and its failures? Or is President Trump so sui generis that it would be an error to draw conclusions for either party about the Republican outtakes in the election? 9, assuming that Republicans hold the Senate, which seems likely, although there would be a contentious race in Georgia, if Mitch McConnell takes a position he did with Obama, that his primary goal is to make him a one-term president by implementing little of his policies, it is a disaster for America. If you look back over the 20th century, not a single one of the great achievements in America that the consensus Jewish community fought for, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the economic justice movements, hunger, homelessness, medical care, the environmental movement, the Soviet Jewry movement, the pro-Israel movement. Here, not one happened because of partisan votes. They all happened as a result of bipartisan coalitions of decency on Capitol Hill and nonpartisan or bipartisan, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious coalitions in communities like Westfield all across America. So, that's just the reality of this. It began to change in '94 with Newt Gingrich arguing that they should put forward their own platform, the Contract for America. They shouldn't compromise on it. They would do better stopping the other side from passing anything than they would from working together to find common ground to pass things. And that began to change things in the 21st century. It has become the norm. Both parties seem to believe they'll do better stopping the other side, and it has led to gridlock at the national level, making what we do at the local and state levels even more important. But this is really a challenge for us about how to restore some kind of bipartisanship. And finally, the good news and bad news about race in this election. The polls show a decided shift amongst white Democrats on racial issues compared to 2018 or 2016. Significant increased support for Black Lives Matter, significant increased support for criminal justice reform, significant support for police reform amongst white Democrats. What is most surprising, however, is that the data about the Gen Z cohort does not show among young whites the kind of similar shift in support that most of us had assumed was taking place. In contrast to the increased young turnout across racial lines for President Obama, if we dig more deeply into this election or go back to Stacey Abrams' remarkable run for governor in 2018, and the noted support her run events from young people, we find it had to do with the increased rate increased turnout of those who are young people of color or those already identified as Democratic voters. It did not appear to shift many young white voters either in 2018 for her or those who voted of the younger, the 18 to 30-year-old cohort, they voted for President Trump at about the same rate as they did in 2016. The broader news about young white people is a bit surprising and disappointing finding for those who are focused on combating racism, as our movement has made a major priority, and one that will require us to rethink some of our tactics and strategies. So those are my key takeaways from the election. And I want to encourage you to put your own in the chat box as I move on to cover some other areas here. So why are the divides so great, and why does President Trump maintain such loyalty? I want to suggest, and again, you should put your own reasons in. I would want to say, one of the most vexing questions that came out for people who are critics of the president is how could 70 million people have voted for him again? And it continues to show how deep the divides are and how little understanding there is of one side or the other side. So let me suggest three reasons here. And again, please feel free to add your own. First, there are millions and millions of people who have been left out of the technological revolution in this country. They live in areas of the country that really don't have good internet access. They were in industries that have been supplanted by tech industries here, and they've seen their manufacturing industries, work by hand kind of industries, manufacturing shut down all across the country. Here, they've been left out of the gains that other areas of the economy have had from globalization here, and they don't believe for a moment that they're going to get retrained at 50 years old into the new economies and the new technologies with jobs that will have the salaries and the benefits that they had before everything changed. They are the first generation in 4 generations now who believe that their children are going to be worse off than they are. And the economic data shows they're right. This is an enormous change from what America has been for nearly 100 years, where if you got an education, you could get a good job. If you were a good and loyal worker, you would get benefits and a pension, and you would be well off. If you really were careful about how you monitored your money, you'd be able to move out of the city to the suburbs here and get a house out in there with a decent mortgage. And if you paid that mortgage off, you would have something to pass on to your children. All of these rules have broken down here in America now, and millions are left out of this. And the Democrats used to have a lock on the unions that were at the core of the industries that we have seen dismantled here. That has radically changed. Secondly, there's a fundamental shift in the demography of America on race, religion, and gender norms. The changes are happening swiftly here. And gender norms, just the whole empowerment of women, the whole question of gender identity and sexual orientation has upset norms that had existed for a couple 100 years in American life and for thousands of years in most of human history. Here, on religion and race, the changes are even more stark. Here, and they're happening very swiftly. And for the silent generation, the baby boomer generation, even many in the Gen X, the America that they were raised in seems to be vanishing and vanishing rapidly. for time, just consider one datum to illustrate this point. In 2008, just 12 years ago, 54% of Americans were white Christians. There were more white people than 54%. There were more Christians than 54%, but 54% were the white Christians who represented the dominant culture of America from the founding of this country until today. 11 years later, that number had plummeted to 44% in 2019. Everyone knows in the next 30 years, we will no longer be a majority white country. And of course, as I said, issues of gender identity combined with this leave people wondering, what am I? Where am I in this new world that I don't understand and I can't control? White Christians, whites in general, are thinking, what happened to the America I, my parents, my grandparents knew? How did this happen? Why did it happen? Are we, those who benefit from white privilege, being replaced by immigrants of color or by Jews? What world will my children know? What will be their place in it? And along comes a leader who says, make America great again, which is heard by millions and millions of America. I will bring back the America you knew and that we love so much. Utterly impossible, of course, and maybe intellectually they realize that, but he powerfully spoke to their fears, their hopes, their self-perceptions. And then there's a whole slew of other gender issues. President Trump had manifested this kind of masculinity that really appealed to many men in America, particularly those who were in industries that were physical industries. His language, his militaristic language, his competitive language, I'm the best, I'm the biggest. The bluster that he was constantly manifesting. All of these things are intended to convey a level of strength that is particularly attractive to men. It touches women on law and order issues here, which was the only place with suburban women that he was regarded as being better than Biden. On every other issue that suburban women cared about, Biden was seen as being better. But this gender distinction he has, this focus on men here also has captured something that the Democratic Party, that polls show amongst President Trump's cohort, is regarded as weak, and one can put it feminine in that. And it, those kind of caricaturishly, stereotypically antiquated, outdated images still have great resonance to many millions of people in America. And you put these things together, and I think it really helps explain what has been happening here. I'm going to try, if you bear with me for a moment, to throw up on the screen some data I want to take a look at with you. You're seeing that, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me just change this to slideshow. And we're up. So I want to take a look at the Jewish vote here and see what happened to the Jewish vote here. I'm going to do this very quickly, but let's move through some of the data that came. It comes from 4 different polls. 2 were taken before the election. One by the Jewish Electorate Institute, a new consortium of Brandeis University and other respected Jewish polling entities, and the second by the American Jewish Committee, their annual poll of Jewish attitudes. It predicted different results in the Jewish vote. One predicted 67%, and the other, the American Jewish Committee, predicted 75%. That's a big difference, right? And then we have 2 exit polls. The exit poll of the AP Votecast is one of the 2 most respected polls used by major media entities. The other is the Edison poll here. And that's one poll we're going to look at. And the second is one done by another respected polling operation on behalf of J Street, the dovish organization on Israel issues. They didn't do the polling themselves. They hired a very respected firm to do it. And here the difference mimicked the difference that we saw in the two pre-polls, with the AP Vocast saying 68% of the Jewish community voted for President Biden, and the J Street poll saying 77%. They are very different polls. Each one has a different strength. The AP Vocast is a huge poll, dealing with 4 times as many Jews or more, 4 times as many Jews as the J Street poll did. But the AP poll and the Edison poll are intended to be representative of the American nation, the whole nation. What it's not good is that small minorities that are concentrically located do not have a representative assessment, and they fully recognize this. In addition to which, the numbers are fairly small. So the Edison poll that the New York Times agreed on, if you looked at the New York Times exit polls the day after, they said the cohort was too small for us to give you any numbers. About 2% of the vote was Jewish, and there just weren't enough numbers to give you accurate numbers. Here, the J Street poll does something different. It takes the authoritative Pew poll from 2014 here, and it curates the people being polled to mimic the age distribution, the geographical distribution, the distribution between different denominations, et cetera. That mimics the Pew poll. So while it's a good sized poll that would have had a relatively decent margin of error even without that, but with that, it is a very strong poll. I can't tell you which is right and which is wrong. The numbers we're dealing with, the universe is just too small, but it does show you a lot of the patterns here. So let me here. So compare it to, bear with me, got to get this out of the way. Here, okay. All right. Here, so compare, just looking at President Trump. If you look at Jews here, they had from Pew, this is from a Pew poll here, they had in the fall here, clearly Jews are more critical of President Trump than others were. Here you can see that white evangelicals, according to Pew, white evangelicals and white Catholics since '94 have trended to be more Republican. Here, Jews, in terms of their views here, Jews are look at on the left here. What you see is, in terms of partisan identification, 50% of Jews identify as Democrats, where only 33% of the general population does. 16% of Jews identify as Republican, where 26% of the general population does. 45% of Jews identify as liberals, compared to 26% of the public, and 19% of Jews identify as conservative, only half the number of the 38% that of the general population that feels the same way. When it came to a vote, and this is from the the Jewish electorate prediction. Here, 67% of all voters, they predicted, this is in or published in early October, would vote. I put this up in this form, the pre-done, so you see the difference between men and women. You see, even in the Jewish community, this showed that there would be a gap of 18% between men and women in their support of President Biden. When it came to domestic issues, What you see is the economic issues are pretty much the major issues, but the coronavirus is number one. And then the economy and healthcare, Medicare and Social Security, and anti-Semitism, and then and Supreme Court justices was high this year. Notice that Israel is down at the bottom. Whether you ask people in polling in the Jewish community which issues are important so they can put a lot of issues down, Israel will rank at the bottom. And if you ask them which one issue is most important, Israel usually will get 4, 5, 6, 7% and won't get more than that. And part of that people attribute to the growing distance between diaspora Jewry and Israel. I actually think it has to do predominantly with a different reason, which is Jews don't think there's a real difference between the two parties. They think Republicans are going to be pro-Israel and Democrats are going to be pro-Israel. So it's not an issue that they're going to base their vote on. Obviously, with President Trump and the steps that he's taken and how those who were supporters of him on those issues felt, there was a bigger difference than probably any point before. But it still remains, I think, an important dynamic and trend here. Interesting to see a sizable proportion of Jewish voters place importance on issues of systemic racism and police brutality. Support for Black Lives Matter, 2/3. Support for the protesters, 2/3. That's pretty high compared to other Caucasian groups. Let me just point out here, as long as I'm talking about Jews and the Black community here, let me just spend a second on a poll that came out in early October about the Muslim community. On their Islamophobia desk of the Institute for Social and Public, whatever, I forget what the U stands for, understanding, I think. What you have is the Jewish community less Islamophobic than any other religious community, including the Muslim community. That may seem surprising, but part of it is the kind of questions that the ADL asks that helps define anti-Semitism here. Do people have dual loyalties? Here is are there conspiracies of Jews across the world, Muslims across the world, to undermine the other countries or other ways of thinking. Here, are they too concerned about themselves rather than about other, those kinds of questions. Here, and Jews turn out to be very low, having gone down since 2018, and actually crossed with Muslims on anti-Muslim stereotypes. Here, what was interesting in a poll is of all the groups most likely to volunteer for political campaigns, Muslims and Jews volunteered at a much higher rate than any of the other groups that were polled did. Here, and on this slide, Jews gave money to campaigns much more than any other group did. Those of you who follow this may have read that for decades now, the Jewish community, particularly in the Democratic Party, has given significant sums in federal elections, particularly presidential elections, sometimes as much as 1/3 of all the money given. There were assessments done at the end of the reporting at the end of September that indicated of the top 25 donors to both parties, the top 25 donors, whether they were Republican or Democrat in this campaign, that 15 of them were Jewish. The Sheldon Adelsons, the George Soroses, different parties here, but give huge amounts of money in campaigns. And notice this is going to the general AP polls now, exit polls. Again, the gap between men and women. Here, it's a pretty significant gap. If you're a man, 52% voted for President Trump, 46% for Biden. If you're a woman, 55%, 44%, et cetera. And it's true with married men and women also. Again, young people do voted more for Biden, but a lot of, as I said, was immense turnout in the Latino community, the African-American community here, and it does go, but then when you get to 45 here, by slight majority, President Trump takes it. It's a drop off for Trump in terms of older people compared to the last one. And gender doesn't matter much, but you see in every age cohort, there is a difference between how men voted and how women voted. Here, in terms of race, 90% of the African American community, 63% of the Latino community. That's a little bit of a drop. You may have read about improvements President Trump made in terms of support. It was particularly true in Florida and in the Rio Grande River Basin in Texas. But in places like Arizona and Nevada and North Carolina, the Latino community actually came out in larger numbers for President Biden than had been in the past. The organizing was more intense there by the Democratic Party. Here, so the one stat I read was that last time they had expected, like last time, that in Arizona 15% of the vote would come from Hispanic voters. It turned out to be 18% of the vote, and it did break more for Biden than this national average was. Here, but again, you see the difference between men and women in every cohort here. And I'm going to pass through this. Here, the most important issues, again, it will predict how they vote. If it's the economy, 81% votes for Trump. If it's healthcare, it's 65% votes for Biden. If it's climate change, 85% votes for Biden here. If it's the coronavirus, 73%. Racism, 78% for Biden. On foreign policy, though, 72% voted for Trump as the most important issue. Again, foreign policy is only 1% of the country. The coronavirus at 41% was the most important issue in general here. I'm going to move through this just to take a look at the religious breakdown. 61% of the Protestant community voted for President Trump. 50% of the Catholic community, a lower vote than he got last time. 71% of the Mormon community, a slight drop in Utah, a pickup in other areas, other Christians, 57%, and all the minority groups voting for President Biden. Evangelicals, 81%, exactly the same. There was thought that there would be pickup for the Democrats, that they were tired of the ethics issues that the president represented. It did not turn out in the voting patterns. In the J Street poll here, it showed that 60% identify as Dems as opposed to 45%. In the other poll we looked at, that 50% are liberal or progressive as opposed to 43%, I think it was, in the other. 77% of the vote for Biden. I just wanted to show this. Men and women, this showed a 12% difference. Big difference between non-college Jews and college-educated graduated Jews here, but not so much on age here. And then this showed a significant difference between the reform and conservative movement, still overwhelmingly 70% in the conservative movement. Another poll I showed, I saw, however, showed only a 10% difference. One of the pre-polls that were done, that whose totals were the same, closest to this, but saw the breakdown differently. Orthodox Jews are the mirror image of the rest of the community here, as Republicans, as et cetera. Here, and same is true with senators and congresspersons as well. So I'm going to skip through this just to make one other observation, and then we'll open it up here, which is, where do we go from here? What's going to happen next? Just very quickly, a couple of outcomes of Jewish particular elections of Jewish interest here. First, my friend Kathy Manning, the former head of the Jewish Federations of North America, social justice champion, won her second effort, but won decisively in North Carolina. The 2018 Jewish Women Crew a squad, as they say, the four people. Kim Schreier won decisively. Elaine Luria and Elisa Slotkin looked like they were going to lose, but like Biden, because of the mail-in votes, eked out elections. I actually don't know whether Susan Wild made it or not. I think people know Max Rose did not get reelected from last time. The two Jewish Republicans, Lee Zeldin on Long Island and David Kutzoff in Tennessee, won decisively their reelections. Here, I love the fact, just a couple of oddities, the new Mexico delegation to Congress, to the House, are all women of color. Here, a QAnon devotee, Marjorie Taylor Greene, was elected from Georgia. Cori Bush, an ally in all the battles against racism and police violence with the Jewish community in Missouri, but an outspoken BDS advocate, won a House seat and will probably join on Israel issues with those who are most critical. Lois Frankel defeated another a very conservative Jewish woman, Louise Loomer, who was an outspoken critic of Islam and Muslims. Sarah McBride won her state Senate race in Delaware to become the first transgender state senator anywhere. In a losing effort, Merav Ben Daniel, an Israeli-born climate scientist, won just, I think it was 27% in Wyoming, but she polled 80,000 votes in a state where there are only 48,000 registered Democrats. And one of my favorites, Raquel Montoya Lewis, became the first Native American to become a justice of the Supreme Court of the state of Washington, and I believe the first Native American Jewish state Supreme Court justice anywhere in the country. Here, what does this mean for Israel? Here, we can pick that up in the conversation if you want to talk about it here, but clearly he will be more focused on the peace process than others. Look, if the Senate holds with the Republican control, obviously he will do a lot through executive orders. He will do a lot on the international scene to rebuild relations with NATO, with the UN system, rejoin the WHO, the Paris Climate Accord. He will move his appointments as expeditiously as possible. If they try to hold it up, he'll probably take a page from President Trump's playbook and simply appoint acting deputy secretaries and get in the people that he wants to get in. I think he'll replace a lot of the people who are put in positions that heretofore have never been political appointments, who are in the intelligence agencies and other places. I think we'll see much stronger people in those positions. Obviously, to do a lot of what he'll want to do, he'll need Senate approval, assuming the Republicans hold on. Here, there are things I think there can be consensus on. I think the handwriting's on the wall. There has to be another COVID relief bill, and both sides have to compromise a bit and get it through. I would not be surprised to see some Republican senators break and support a massive infrastructure program. They had called for it for 4 years. It never was even proposed, but Biden's obviously would have a stronger green energy and technology component, but it has to happen. The fight for reproductive rights to protect the ACA. He's going to have to make improvements in the ACA. Everyone knows there are problems with the ACA, but he obviously wants to keep the major part of it intact here. And then the real fight will be over younger judges that he will probably try to appoint, and as forcefully as possible. It will be hard. We did get judges through in 6 years of the Obama administration when the Republicans held the Senate, but they held it up and dragged it out. And we're going to have to do the opposite. The things the Republicans want that can be held up to swap for it. And then finally, the bills on the John Lewis voting rights bill to fix the Shelby decision. And I presume we'll see a constitutional amendment after this election to fix Citizens United. So with that, let me stop and open it up. A huge agenda for us to have. It's not going to be an easy road, even for those who are supporters of President Biden and are happy by these results. We face some very tough sledding to get things through, and that requires trying our best to reach across the aisle and get some Republicans to be supportive of this work.
Oh, David, thank you so much. David, you're famous for packing a lot into a few minutes, and you didn't disappoint us in quantity or quality. Thank you so much. So let's jump to questions, and we encourage you to add some questions. So let's jump in terms of which came first. Stuart Nis asked the question: does the fact that there were no riots, looting, or protests say anything about who was doing these actions prior?
I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question. Here, two different pieces of this. We do know who was organizing most of the big protests here, and the fact that things were held in check and people let it play out. I think they were encouraged by allies to hold off in that regard. The president did try to encourage protests to say stop the vote in all the states except in Arizona. Here, where ironically there were pro-Trump protests to count the votes in Arizona, and it's we know what happened there. That part seemed to have worked. Most people had really tried to hold these things in check. And I think people were truly willing still, with all the cynicism about our system of government and how it's functioning these days, with all the frustrations with democracy and all the conflicts we have, people were willing to let it play out. Those who were behind the violence is much harder to determine. And why there wasn't more violence, I'm not sure. I think people really felt, you do violence better when you're in a larger crowd here, and you can be somewhat anonymous within those larger crowds. I don't think, without the larger crowds, that there was any real incentive to take that risk.
Great, thank you. The next question from Barbara Steinfeld, you to a considerable degree answered, but it's so important that I think it's worth returning to. And that is, why do you think Democrats have lost support among blue-collar, middle-class electorate?
Well, pretty much for the reasons that I laid out, and I'd love if others would put other thoughts in the chat about why they think we've alienated blue-collar workers. And I'm talking here mostly where, I don't want to be stereotypical. There's obviously enormous diversity, but you're talking people who primarily do not have college educations, who work with their hands either in manufacturing or labor kinds of jobs. And, they really have been savage here. So, that's why I think that happened in the other issues that I laid out before. But I'd love to hear others, see other comments about why and what they do about it, because everyone thought that Biden would be able to really bring these people back with his longtime record of working with the unions and blue collar workers and stuff. And it didn't happen to the degree that they had anticipated. And if you don't get them back here, this can turn out to be as much an anti-Trump aberration as 2016 was a pro-Trump aberration having to do with Trump. And so these two twin challenges of the youth, the white youth who did not swing in any noticeable number to the Democratic vote, and the blue collar workers who did not swing at the rate that they had hoped they would here, I think are the two really urgent challenges that and as well as figuring out how far to the progressive wing they can go and hold everything together here that the Democratic Party faces.
Right. Democrats are going to have to look very, very hard at that. So Marilyn Lieberman.
They will, but here's a paradox, just one word on this. Sure. Here, some of the most progressive things actually would help blue collar workers Here, guarantees of jobs and, getting everyone in a college education, here, having much more support mechanisms when people run into economic trouble, et cetera. The real crisis we're going to have, by the way, the imminent crisis is going to be when the rules against eviction from renters who can't pay their rent come. Millions of people in the middle of winter could be forced out of their homes. And I pray that that will require a pretty progressive response to avoid that. And I pray that there will be Republicans who will join on that. But the progressives are going to argue the best way to help build blue collar workers and bring them back is to implement progressive programs. So that's one of the ironies of
and the irony is that this is part of the platform of the party, though it, as you said, it did move toward more center, and blue collar workers didn't get that. There's a lot in their interest in the Democratic Party, and that's a big question for the future. Okay, let's
Maybe a couple more. Yeah, a couple more questions in the chat box as well.
Right. From Marilyn Lieberman, I think Americans are in favor of divided government in general, rather than handing full power to one party. You agree?
I'm not sure. That is a very reasonable interpretation of what happened. Here, I don't know quite what's going on. And looking at the surveys, the exit polls, it's really hard to correlate some of the attitudes on issues to how the vote turned out. It may be that the country is just more conservative than we anticipated, and this was an anti-Trump aberration that got Biden in at such huge numbers in the popular vote above what the president obtained, that people were just tired of enough people were tired. Every million he lost was a million gain, and there was a difference of 2 million in the outcome of the vote. He loses a million, Biden gains a million here. So, that may be part of it. It may be that there are people who like divided government and are fearful about going too far for the right and left and vote for it. All of these things are possible. It could be idiosyncratic to the particular Senate races that happened, that the Democratic candidates just weren't as attractive as people thought they were here. But the Democrats lost in state legislatures too. So that bodes ill for the census and the redistribution of seats at the how the districts get drawn, and for our ability to offset what the gridlock of the federal government by the extraordinary work that our congregations have really increasingly under Jonah Pesner's leadership at the RAC have been doing at the state levels and the local levels. We're making a difference there, but it's going to be a much harder lift than we had anticipated it would be.
I want to add a shout out to our congregation, to Rabbi Prosnett and our clergy, and our task committees for getting out the vote.
Yeah, the civic engagement stuff you did, we were following. We've lifted it up as an example of one of the better programs, et cetera. But all across the country, our congregations were great. I mean, we touched at least 500,000 voters a year, many of them minority voters, and made a huge difference. And we got our congregations, particularly the younger voters. And remember, if a younger voter votes in the first 2 elections of their life, they're likely to vote for the rest of their lives. If they don't vote in the first 2 elections, here a much lower percentage will come back to voting, certainly on a regular basis. So what you guys did on that level too was equally important.
A lot of us exhausted our entire U.S. stamp in getting it out. We were without stamps for days and days and days. Lucille Rosenberg, what percentage of Jewish vote in the U.S. is Orthodox? How has that increased or decreased since 2016? Any idea on that, David?
Say it once more.
What percentage of the Jewish vote in the U.S. is Orthodox? How has that increased or decreased since 2016?
we don't know the answer to that. The numbers are just not high enough, but let me just give you some numbers that may give you a little bit of insight here. The polls on the Jewish community have consistently indicated that the Orthodox population is about 10 to 14%. And it's remained that way now for like 40 years, despite all of the assumptions because of the high birth rate. And then in the last couple of generations, the very high percentage of people who have moved out of the public schools, as most Orthodox kids went to, Chuck, when you and I were kids, here, they now almost all go to full-time Jewish day schools, either community or Orthodox day schools. A very high percentage spend a gap year in Israel. It should make them more conservative, and it should should have meant more of them will keep their identity. Remember, the Pew poll indicated that while when you and I were growing up, the conservative movement was far and away the largest stream of the Jewish community. Today, the Reform movement is as large as the Orthodox, conservative, and Reconstructionists combined. The only liberal theological denomination that's grown by leaps and bounds in the last 60 years. Here, and on the question that Pew asked about, which stream did you grow up in and which stream are you now? We keep even a higher percentage of our own people than the Orthodox do. They lose them to the conservative and the Reform movement, usually not to the nuns, the none of the above. Here, we lose ours to the none of the above, but they move over here, and it's one of the reasons that we've grown here. But because they're 10 to 14% of the population, and they're much higher with their kids, here, their kids make up a much larger cohort than our kids make up in the other streams. Here, it probably means it's less than the 10 to 14% of the vote. It's probably something like 7% or 8% of the Jewish vote. And obviously, where there are concentrations in areas of Florida, Los Angeles, Chicago, and mostly New York, here, heavy concentration of Orthodox votes, it'll be higher. But if you ask nationally, I would guess it's 8, 9%, 7, 8%, something like that is the vote. It did seem to break very strongly before Trump, and even stronger in Florida, and had a real impact there.
Yep. David, with your permission, I'd like to take the couple of questions that are still up here. If you'd like to go on another 10 minutes or so, you okay with that?
I'm fine.
Oh, great.
I appreciate people sticking around.
It's great, great. Mark Epstein, our immediate past president, says he's concerned about the apparent rush to revive the Iran deal. Why is reviving the Iran deal so high on the agenda?
Well, remember, the Iran deal had the support of the vast number of past heads of the Israeli military and of Israeli intelligence agencies. They felt it was the best way to prevent Iran from building a nuclear capacity. And according to our intelligence reports, the Iranians were living by the terms of the agreement. Once the agreement we lifted the agreement. For a while, they played it out because the Europeans said, stick with it, we'll try and get the Americans back. When that didn't happen, here, they now are expanding again, building or reopening more centrifuges, and expanding things again. So the argument is get them back where they were. Here, I think, at the time I was inside the State Department when the treaty was being negotiated, and because we had some concerns about the issues, human rights and religious freedom issues, here I was at a number of briefings there. We knew at the time that the issues that later bothered everyone else, their mischief in the region, their support for irredentist forces in the region, and the destabilizing impact they were having in Syria and Iraq. Here, we knew that those would become issues and sources of criticism here. But it was much more about that than it was about the deal. It was much more about their missile capability, which was not part of the negotiations, than it was. One can argue that was a flaw, but we didn't believe we could get a treaty otherwise. And we felt for Israel's sake, for our sake, the most important thing was to stop the expansion of their nuclear capability. The European countries have refused to go along with more with the unilateral sanctions that we've imposed. They think that we made a mistake. We can get them back. And I think in light of Iran's activity since the time the treaty was finalized, there would be greater support by the international community to also try and work out agreements with the Iranians that would crack down on some of the other aspects of their behavior that would do. But right now, a choice between stopping their nuclear expansion and letting it go. Here, Israel's going to be better off, America and the region, to continue the halt that the original agreement had been able to bring about.
Okay. If we can quickly, three final questions. First, this one is kind of a technical one. We know voter turnout from Lucille Rosenberg. We know voter turnout was extraordinary. Has it been adjusted for population growth in the past 5 years? Is it still extraordinary in light of population growth?
Yes, absolutely. No question about it whatsoever. Here, the population growth is some millions of people here, obviously, usually weighted, particularly with the crackdown on immigration, usually weighted to young people, and the birth rates who are not voters yet. The voting increase was enormous compared to the population.
Right. David Mullen, I've seen and heard a lot of opinions about Trump voters from liberals. All of them have been derogatory. Looking down on people is no way to get their support.
So I would say, work with me to figure out how you talk about behavior of a president that people genuinely believe is reprehensible, dangerous to democracy, demeaning to other people, has been heard by right-wing violent groups as a stamp of approval for their activities here. How do we talk about them in a way that is not needlessly divisive and mean-spirited? I mean, one of the things I always say is, don't talk about people, talk about their policies. Don't talk about people. Don't assume you know what's in someone's heart. Talk about what they say and criticize what they say. Don't criticize them as a human being here. But it's really hard when somebody like the president, who has been so consistent with what he said, that is so violative of the fundamental norms of decency and fairness and compassion that have been part of America here, that it just makes it hard. I will say, I think the Democrats will make a major mistake if they continue the ad hominem attacks on President Trump, rather than dealing with the very real challenges that we have, that, as Biden said, wants to bring us together. If we continue to focus on how bad the president was, here, rather than how do we sensibly gain enough bipartisan support to undo the negative positions that he took, here, it will be a mistake and will play into exactly the concern that you expressed in your question. So it's a difficult tightrope to walk.
Right. And finally, related to this, why do you think Democrats lost House members in this election?
Indulge me to just answer one other question in the chat box, lest I be misunderstood. Here, I see that Stuart Nice, or Nice, I don't know how it's pronounced. Stuart asks, did I suggest that there were pro-Trump protests like those in Seattle or Philadelphia? If you're talking about the ones that spilled into violence, no, that's not what I was saying. What I was saying is the president encouraged his supporters elsewhere to protest against the counting of the ballots. In Arizona, his supporters did come, and there was this picture you may remember of armed protesters who come to demand that they count the ballots, because in Arizona, he was picking up the mail-in ballots, or the ones that hadn't been counted. So, I mean, it was one of the ironies well commented on in the public. But I wasn't, if you're talking about, the extremist violence that happened in the Black Lives Matter protests and that kind of thing. It was nothing like that from the people who were protesting for the president in Arizona. I just wanted to clarify that. And the final one you asked me was what?
One is, why do you think Democrats lost House members in this election?
I don't know here. I really don't. I mean, we talked about that. There were some who want divided government. It may be attractiveness. There were very attractive candidates last time. Here, perhaps some were less. Here, some were gains in the 2018 election from longtime Republican districts who picked up their people. I know some did hold those seats here, but a number of those lost, and that's not unexpected that might have happened. What didn't happen was this kind of blue wave that many people had predicted, many of the polls had predicted before the country in Texas and North Carolina, even South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, here, that just didn't happen at all. And the House break, the Democrats still have the majority, but it's going to be much harder now here. And again, the question is, what are the takeaways? Progressives will say, you did that because you weren't as different from the Republicans as you needed to be. Bring a progressive message, and people really have something to choose between here. And others say, no, there was the fear of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party that drove people to try and move back some of the Republican people who had lost seats that had been lost in the last election. I really don't know what the answer is. That's why I was hoping to see some of your own thoughts on this. It's a really tough thing here. So let me conclude with the famous dictum of our teacher and mentor and inspiration for so many decades, Al Vorspan, who was fond of saying that the difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that an optimist argues that this is the best of all possible worlds, and a pessimist agrees. Here, I mean, we Jews are the eternal optimists. Here, we're not the prisoners of the mistakes we've made in the past. Here, we have helped make America, with all of its very, very serious problems, a far more decent, far more compassionate, far more just country today than it was 100 years ago. There are over 200 million, 250 million minorities and women in this country who enjoy rights that 100 years ago they could only dream about in their wildest imagination. With all of the structural racism, with all of the structural sexism, here, that remains true. We have a long way to go. But as we say on Niviata, you and I together, we can do it. And Iraq deeply appreciates the partnership with Temple Emanu-El of Westfield, with its rabbis, with its lay leaders here. Our voice is needed today more than ever. And thank you for giving me the chance to speak to everyone.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the great work that you're doing, for being with us. And this was a wonderful session. We look forward to December 7th, seeing all of you back with us. And Rabbi Prosnit, a final word for us?
Just thank you again, and we continue to do the work here at Temple Emanu-El. As many of you know, we kicked off RAC New Jersey this past year, and we're really excited for us to move forward. If you're interested in getting involved on a state level as well as the national level, please let us know as we do the important work in our own communities.
Well, thanks for your leadership, Rabbi. The congregation here, you're doing such a great job in the state and all of the social justice work that you've always been doing.
Yeah, your leadership on state level, Rabbi Prosnit, has been palpable, and we've felt the impact of it. Thank you for that, and all who've worked with you. David, we wish you good health and stay safe. To everybody, stay safe. An early happy Thanksgiving. Thanks again to all of you for being with us, and we wish you the best.
Take care.